Welcome to Grace Lutheran Church. Pastor Stecker here as we continue our Bible study on Mere Christianity. Today we begin the fourth and final book, and we take a look at doctrine and the Trinity. Happy Wednesday. Today we transition into Book 4. The final book in Mere Christianity. In summary, in chapter 1, we looked at a philosophical argument for the existence of God. In book 2, we looked at comparative religions, how they differ fundamentally in their approach to who God is, and why Lewis argues that Christianity is the one religion which both makes sense and represents truth. In book 3, we looked at what Christians believe regarding various common religious questions. And now in Book 4, we get into real theology. Theology meaning the science or the study of who God is. This book will likely be more challenging than Book 3, but it can also be more rewarding. Studying and contemplating the reality of the Creator isn't easy. It couldn't be, as we are looking at something so far beyond us. It would be like a mouse understanding the inner workings of a man. However, we are called to contemplate this. We are called to learn and to ponder the wonder and the glory of God. And furthermore, we have an advantage that the mouse never had. God has taken it upon himself to reveal himself in part to us, inviting us to learn and to grow in him. If these next few videos stretch and challenge you, that's good. Don't run away. Don't give up just because you don't grasp everything the first time. This is serious business, but it's seriously helpful to our growth as Christians. Lewis gives us an account at the beginning of chapter 1 on the importance of dogma and theology. He emphasizes this importance with fervor. I invite you to listen now to his explanation on the importance of taking the time to study, learn, and grow in real theology, the science and the study of God. Lewis puts it this way: "In a way, I quite understand why some people are put off by theology. I remember once when I had been giving a talk to the RAF, an old hard-bitten officer got up and said, 'I've no use for all that stuff. But mind you, I'm a religious man too. I know there's a God. I felt him, out alone in the desert at night, the tremendous mystery. And that's just why I don't believe all your neat little dogmas and formulas about him. To anyone who's met the real thing, they all seem so petty and pedantic and unreal.' Now, in a sense, I quite agreed with that man. I think he had probably had a real experience of God in the desert. And when he turned from that experience to the Christian creeds, I think he really was turning from something real to something less real. In the same way, if a man has once looked at the Atlantic from the beach and then goes and looks at a map of the Atlantic, he also will be turning from something real to something less real, turning from real waves to a bit of colored paper. But here comes the point. The map is admittedly only colored paper. But there are two things you have to remember about it. In the first place, it is based on what hundreds and thousands of people have found out by sailing the real Atlantic. In that way, it has behind it masses of experience just as real as the one you could have from the beach. Only, while yours would be a single isolated glimpse, the map fits all those different experiences together. In the second place, if you want to go anywhere, the map is absolutely necessary. As long as you are content with walks on the beach, your own glimpses are far more fun than looking at a map. But the map is going to be more use than walks on the beach if you want to get to America. Now, theology is like the map. Merely learning and thinking about the Christian doctrines, if you stop there, is less real and less exciting than the sort of thing my friend got in the desert. Doctrines are not God. They are only a kind of map. But that map is based on the experience of hundreds of people who really were in touch with God. Experiences compared with which any thrills or pious feelings you and I are likely to get on our own are very elementary and very confused. And secondly, if you want to get any further, you must use the map. You see, what happened to that man in the desert may have been real and was certainly exciting. But nothing comes of it. It leads nowhere. There is nothing to do about it, in fact. That is just why a vague religion, all about feeling God in nature and so on, is so attractive. It is all thrills and no work, like watching the waves from the beach. But you will not get to Newfoundland by studying the Atlantic that way, and you will not get eternal life by simply feeling the presence of God in flowers or music. Neither will you get anywhere by looking at maps without going to sea, nor will you be very safe if you go to sea without a map. This point from Lewis is immeasurably important. I often hear the similar sentiment from Christians and vague religious people today. They often place experience above theology. Or to put it another way, they minimize the importance of studying the Bible and being part of a church community. Lewis articulates well that experiences are great. I can vouch for this. I've had at least one experience that seemed otherworldly. However, the Bible, church life, prayer life, being part of a Christian community, these are essential to the Christian experience. Why, you may ask? Lewis goes on to explain how theology safeguards us from being led astray by our thoughts, our emotions, and our moods. Everyone reads. Everyone hears things discussed. Consequently, if you do not listen to theology, that will not mean that you have no ideas about God. It will mean that you have a lot of wrong ones, bad, muddled, out-of-date ideas. For a great many of the ideas about God which are trotted out as novelties today are simply the ones which real theologians tried centuries ago and rejected. To believe in the popular religion of modern England is retrogression, like believing the earth is flat. Once again, the danger is not that we will cease to think about God. The danger is that we will start to think about God in the wrong way, to have the wrong ideas. I can attest to this. One of the most important parts of our seminary education was church history, where we learned about many of the same mistakes that are made over and over again by thinkers both within and outside of Christianity. Those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it, and those that do not know theology are doomed to confusion. Now, all of this is meant to first give you praise. If you have made it this far in this series, you have been taking theology and the study of God very seriously. It is second meant to motivate you as we dive into some of the most beautiful and profound truths about who God is and who we are in relation to Him. And third, this is meant to cement the importance of church and Christian education. We are called to have faith like a child, but minds like adults, that won't be swayed to and fro by every doctrine that reaches our ears, but rather strong Christians who will stand resolute in God's teaching and revelation of Himself in the Bible and in the church. Now, without further ado, let us dive into chapters 1 and 2 of Book 4. Now, regarding chapter 3, it is personally one of my favorite chapters in the entire book. It explains a concept that has clarified in my own mind some deep theological questions. However, it is a complicated and very deep subject. Because of this, I don't feel I can properly summarize what Lewis is saying in this format. Because of this, I encourage you rather to read the chapter on your own. It won't take more than 5 to 7 minutes. And I will always be available for discussion on that chapter. To help you with this, I have included a link in an audio version of this chapter in the description below. We have already covered part of chapter 1 in our introduction. Now we will move forward as Lewis begins to lay the foundation for understanding God, which we can only do by understanding the doctrine of the Trinity. To start, Lewis wants to articulate an important distinction between making and begetting. To put it simply, to make something is to create it. To beget is like the begetting of a child. God creates nature. It represents Him, but it's not of the same substance. But God begets His own Son, Jesus, who is of the same substance of the Father. This is why our own Nicene Creed says, "The Son is begotten of the Father, not created, and done so before all worlds." This means that before anything was created, the Son was begotten. The Son is different than rest of creation in the same way a child is different from a computer. Now the key is this. We as humans have been given life, but what we naturally lack is a spiritual life, which is the kind of life that only exists in God. Lewis works to help us understand this by pointing out that there are 2 different words for life. There's bios, which has to do with the natural life that exists from things like food, air, and water. This is the life that all animals and humans have. And then the second one, which is zoe, which is the spiritual life, which is in God from all eternity. The point of Christianity is that we all have the bios, but we need to receive the zoe. Lewis puts it this way: in reality, the difference between biological life and spiritual life is so important that I am going to give them two distinct names. The biological sort, which comes to us through nature, and which, like everything else in nature, is always tending to run down and decay so that it can only be kept up by incessant subsidies from nature in the form of air, water, food, etc., is bios. The spiritual life, which is in God from all eternity, and which made the whole natural universe, is zoe. Bios has, to be sure, a certain shadowy or symbolic resemblance to zoe, but only the sort of resemblance there is between a photo and a place, or a statue and a man. A man who changed from having bios to having zoe would have gone through as big a change as a statue which changed from being a carved stone to being a real man. And this is precisely what Christianity is about. The world is a great sculptor's shop. We are the statues, and there is a rumor going around the shop that some of us are someday going to come to life. In our last chapter, we focused on the difference between making and begetting. A man begets a child, but only makes a statue. God begets Christ, but only makes man. In this chapter, Lewis will further unpack the relationship between the Trinity. And let's go about it in this way. Christianity asserts that a Christian must be brought into the life of God, but also remain themselves, meaning that our salvation is not like we being a drop in the ocean. We are not absorbed into God in a way where we disappear. Rather, we are brought into the life of God, but we remain very much ourselves in this process. So, how does this work? Lewis now moves on to explain how it is that we are taken into the life of God, or born from above with the spiritual life zoe. He points out that it is important that we understand what this life of God looks like. And to help us do so, he uses a strong but possibly challenging illustration. He speaks about dimensions. Now, we live in the third dimension, which means that in space we can move in three ways. We can move left and right, backwards, forwards, up and down. This is what is meant by third dimension. But as a thought experiment, let's unpack how the first two dimensions work. If you are using only the first dimension, you could draw a straight line. If you are using the second dimension, you could draw a figure such as a square. And of course, a square is made up of 4 straight lines. Now, a step further. If you have 3 dimensions, you can then build, say, a cube, a thing like a dice or a lump of sugar. And this cube is made up of 6 squares. If this is challenging for you, I encourage you to look at the second link in the description below to see an animated reading of this chapter, which will help you picture what Lewis is talking about. It's a great resource, and it's called C.S. Lewis Doodle. But the important takeaway from this illustration, for the moment, is that in the first dimension, you only have straight lines. In a second dimensional world, you have many lines that make up one figure. And in the third dimension world, you have many figures, such as squares, which make up one solid body, such as a cube. In other words, as you advance in the dimensions, you get things that are more complicated, but that always contain, they do not lose, what was found in the simpler levels. The only difference is that they are brought together in ways that you couldn't possibly imagine at the lower levels. All of this is used to help us understand the Christian account of God. Lewis summarizes this in this way. Now, the Christian account of God involves just the same principle. The human level is a simple and rather empty level. On the human level, one person is one being, and any 2 persons are 2 separate beings, just as in 2 dimensions, say on a flat sheet of paper, one square is one figure, and any 2 squares are 2 separate figures. On the divine level, you still find personalities, but up there you find them combined in new ways, which we who do not live on that level cannot imagine. In God's dimension, so to speak, you find a being who is 3 persons while remaining one being, just as a cube is 6 squares while remaining one cube. Just as a cube is 6 squares while remaining one cube, so God, in a higher dimension than us, is 3 persons but one God. And of course, because we are lower, we can't fully grasp it. But as Lewis says, once we are told this, it feels as if we should have been able to guess it all along, because it fits right in line with so many other things that we already know. And this is what gives us a hint of the Christian life. See, the point of the Christian life is that God is pulling us up and further in to be joined into the Zoe, the spiritual life. Yet for this to happen, we have one more important point. Lewis points out that God can only show himself as he really is. And just as God is more than one person, he chooses to show himself to men who are united together. This is of paramount importance. See, it has become a popular idea that your faith is something which is private, that it's just between you and God. But this isn't the case. Faith isn't private, and it's not just between you and God either. Christian faith, God revealing himself to us, happens when Christian men and women are united together, loving one another, showing him to one another. This is how God intended humanity to be like. As Lewis says, like players in one band or organs in one body. This means that the only real way that we can learn about God is in a Christian community, waiting for him, studying him, worshiping him, showing him to one another, together as one brotherhood. This is why we join together for church. This is why we gather together around the altar of the sacrament. This is why the community of church is essential. It's not just that we like to be social, or just that the service is more fun when we're gathered together. It's because God is himself a community. He needs us to mirror that so that he can reveal himself to us. This may seem unnecessarily complicated. It certainly won't be as simple and well packaged as some of the fads that come and go. But this is to be expected. Lewis closes out this chapter saying, if Christianity was something we were making up, of course we could make it easier. But it's not. We cannot compete in simplicity with people who are inventing religions. How could we? We are dealing with fact. Of course, anyone can be simple if he has no facts to bother about. Thank you for joining us for today's study as we look at the first 2 chapters of Book 4. I do invite you to look at the resource below or read chapter 3 on your own. It's a very beneficial chapter, but it's one that probably has to be read in its completion. Take care, have a wonderful day, and God bless.